Your Humanities Half Hour is brought to you by the Northern Marianas Humanities Council.
Hafidades and Tiro. Welcome to Your Humanities Half Hour. I'm Catherine Perry, and joining us today is our friend, historian Don Farrell, here to talk about his latest book, Tinian and the Bomb Project, Project Alberta and Operation Centerboard. I think I messed up on the title because there's just so much detail in this book, Don. It's almost 500 pages, rich history you've got here.
Yes, it was a complicated project. You drew attention to the correct issue, Project Alberta and Operation Centerboard. Many books have been written about the atomic bombs and their use, many pro and very many negative. This story is about Project Alberta, 54 men who were hand-picked from the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos and Wendover Air Force Base, where the bombs were tested. And they were sent to Tinian for the purpose of receiving the parts for the bombs, checking them, and then assembling the bombs and preparing them for delivery to Japan. Operation Centerboard was the military plan to drop atomic bombs on Japan. Two of them, one right after the other, for the purpose of shocking the Japanese into recognizing that we had a weapon that they did not have and that there was no defense against this weapon, and therefore they should immediately surrender. And because of the work done by the Project Alberta team on Tinian, Operation Centerboard was successful, and the war came to an end within 5 days after the dropping of the bombs.
I was going to ask if you could tell us the story during our time together today. Fewer questions from me, more storytelling from you. But before we get into it, I just want to say the book is very readable. I came in early to the studio to do a mic test, and I got caught up in reading the book, didn't get to my mic test.
That's good. I like that.
For example, everyone at base camp, reading here, was ordered to lie face down on the ground with their feet pointing in the direction of the blast. The welder's glasses that base camp stockroom clerks were supposed to issue to all personnel had not arrived. Major Fubar. This sounds a lot like Don.
Well, for those of us who served in uniform, everybody knows what a FUBAR is. But anyway, yes, I did my best to try to make it readable. It is a long text. I did my best to make it complete and accurate, right? But at the same time, wanting to make it readable for those people who want to know what really happened on Tinian and in the Marianas during World War II that brought the war to an end.
Take us back to the beginning. The race begins.
The story has to begin with the fact that the Germans were the ones who discovered nuclear fission, and therefore were the first people who had the opportunity to begin working on the concept of could the phenomenon of nuclear fission discovered in Germany in 1939, could that philosophy, could that basic research turn into a weapon that some nation could use to control the world? And therefore, when many German scientists ran away from Germany because many of them were Jewish, right, and were threatened with death, and arrived in America, went to President Franklin Roosevelt at the time and said, look, if the Germans get this thing and they develop the bomb before we do, not only do we lose, the whole world loses, because they will use it, and they will use it to control the earth. So that eventually convinced President Roosevelt to agree to begin an atomic bomb project that was later named the Manhattan Project.
And how did they go about picking who was going to be a part of this team?
National security was the top measure, right? If we were going to do this, how do we keep our work, the American side work, secret from the Germans, the Japanese, and everybody else who were working at the same time on the same problem? So, choosing the leadership, one, the people who were most likely to be able to effectuate the development and construction of the bomb. So everybody that was attached to the Manhattan Project, and then particularly the people who were sent to Tinian to develop and assemble the bombs, were the top notch. And everything was done under top security. The world was shocked when they read the newspaper in America on August 6th, the morning after the Hiroshima bomb was dropped, announcing that the United States had developed this new weapon. And that's a measure of success, that their original goal to keep it secret was achieved. And it's hard to imagine how they did that, because the parts were manufactured at various factories all across America. And then those parts had to be shipped to San Francisco, where they were consolidated, boxed up, and put on ships that brought those parts, enough parts for the construction of 50 bombs, shipped to Tinian. How do you keep something like that secret? And they were able to do it.
Are you saying that they had the capacity, if necessary, to build 50 bombs there in Tinian?
Absolutely. They built several bombs on Tinian, not just the 2 active bombs that were used. Out of that 50, some of them were test bombs. At the time that Tinian was chosen to be the active base, forward base for the Manhattan Project, the bombs were not finished. The parts were not completed. They hadn't been manufactured. Some hadn't even been invented yet. So they chose these 54 guys from the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos and Wendover and shipped them to Tinian and said, you guys be there and ready to assemble, to receive these parts, inspect them, and then assemble the bombs and deliver them when they are ready. So several of the bombs that were manufactured on Tinian were test bombs. They hadn't physically completed them, particularly the mechanism to make sure that they exploded at the right altitude. They didn't want the thing to hit the ground. If it hits the ground, half the energy goes in the ground. You've wasted your effort, right? Not only that, but Oppenheimer had predicted what we later called fallout. Couldn't know what fallout was until there was a bomb actually used and there was something that fell out that you could measure, right? But Oppenheimer had predicted that the bombs would sweep up irradiated material from the ground into that cloud that you so often see, and that it would eventually fall back down on the ground and it would hurt people, right? People would get radiation poisoning from it. Well, that mechanism didn't arrive on Tinian until only a few days before the bomb was actually used. It was still being tested on Tinian.
Wow.
Up until a week before it was actually used. All of that took place on Tinian. One of the funniest stories of the whole bomb project, and it's hard to tell funny stories about a weapon that kills thousands of people, a weapon of mass destruction, the world's first use of a weapon of mass destruction. But the scientists had done their job. They had been picked. They had all said, okay, I will go to the forward base. They didn't know where Tinian was. They didn't know what a Tinian was. But they knew that they had a job to do, and they had to achieve it. So at the last minute, they were said, okay, you're going to become Army officers. And these scientists said, we don't want to join the military. You don't have any choice, right? We cannot send civilians into a combat area on a combat mission because it's against the Geneva Convention. America, of course, was still following the rules. And so they said, take off your clothes and put on these uniforms. And you, Dr. So-and-so, you're a colonel. And you, Dr. So-and-so, you're a major. And so they took off their clothes and put on uniforms that didn't fit them, right? And then they joked among each other about, how come you got to be a colonel and I'm only a major? And they sent them to Tinian. When they got to Tinian, now they got these uniforms on that don't fit. It's hot, right? They're leaving
Tinian.
The mountains of Los Alamos at 7,200 feet. They end up on Tinian, right? And they sweat the minute they walk off their non-air conditioned aircraft. And so they immediately cut off the sleeves of their fatigues and cut off the pants, and they're wearing, because there's no uniforms necessary on Tinian. It's a combat zone, right? And it's kind of humorous if you can look at the war in a humorous way. But it's a great story. It's all in the National Archives, and I was very fortunate to get a chance to be the first person to read the entire atomic bomb files.
Don Farrell talking about his book, Tinian and the Bomb. More after this break.
Did you know that you can donate up to $5,000 to the Humanities Council through the CNMI Education Tax Credit Program? Donations from individuals and corporations qualify and can be used to offset your local wage and salary tax, BGRT, and earnings tax. Call our office at 235-4785 to see how you can support humanities programs in our community and obtain a tax credit for your donation. Sizuus Maasi, Olomai, and thank you.
Welcome back to Your Humanities Half Hour. Don, in your research, did you find any particular challenges specific to Tinian and the environment and its isolation that the developers had in putting the bombs together and completing the mission?
All I can say is Tinian was chosen by a Navy commander who came to Guam in February, right? After General Groves realized that Admiral Nimitz needed to be told what was going on. Nobody had been informed about the Manhattan Project. Nobody on Guam, Admiral Nimitz, General LeMay, all the big names you hear about in World War II, they knew nothing about the atomic bomb or the 509th Composite Group or nothing. So this poor Navy commander had to fly out to Guam. Now, he's a commander. Guam's got admirals and generals out. They got plenty of stars, right? So he is carrying with him a letter from Admiral King, who is Chief of Staff of the United States Navy. He's the guy. And so he flies directly from Los Alamos to Tinian. 2 days on little airplanes with no air conditioning, no stewardesses.
Island hopping, right?
Island hopping all the way from Los Alamos. And so by the time he arrives on Guam, it's a direct flight. He's on an emergency mission, right? So by the time he arrives on Guam, he is sweaty. His uniform is,
plastered to him.
Whatever.
Probably.
And so he gets to Nimitz's office. They won't even let him in. I mean, what's a commander, right? When you got admirals and generals running around. And he says, well, I have a letter from Admiral King to hand deliver to Admiral Nimitz. And they said, well, you'll have to let me see it first. And he says, no. My orders are to hand deliver this to Admiral Nimitz only. And so they finally let him in, and he goes into Nimitz. He opens up his shirt and pulls out this, you know what a money belt is?
Yes.
Wraps around it. It's made out of cotton, right? Well, it's as sweaty as he is. So he pulls out this limp, wet envelope, right? and dangles it in front of the admiral and says, "Admiral Nimitz, this letter is to you from Admiral King." Well, he reads it, and Admiral King says, "Whatever this guy says, just do it."
That's what the letter said.
And, well, it didn't say that exactly. It's quoted in the book.
All right, got to read the book.
Okay. But essentially it says this guy's going to tell you about our new weapon. And so Admiral Nimitz listens to him, and Commander Ashworth says, "The bomb will explode with the power of 20,000 tons of TNT." That is like 1,000 B-29s dropping their entire 20-ton load at 1 second. And so Nimitz is looking at him like, what is this, some kind of science fiction? And he says, "Okay." King says do it. We're gonna do it. Go. You better go check Tinian, because nothing's happening on Guam with Air Force operations. This is a Navy operation. So he goes to Tinian, and he looks at Tinian, and the Seabees have done a great job. The 313th Bomb Wing is beginning to arrive, and he says, this is going to be our place. And it was 100 miles closer to the target, which meant 200 miles of fuel if they get in trouble. And so the decision was made that Tinian would be America's launch pad for nuclear warfare.
Tell us a little bit more about the story of the Enola Gay and Little Boy.
Well, the Little Boy bomb was a uranium bomb, a very simple device. It was not complicated at all. The hard part of creating Little Boy was refining uranium, because the active ingredient of uranium that makes things go kaboom, uranium-235, is only 0.7% of the raw ore, the rock you get out of the ground that's called uranium. And so that was hugely, how do you physically separate isotopes, right, from an element of that magnitude? Chemistry people out there will understand what I'm talking about, right? If it was a smaller element, it wouldn't have been so much problem. But uranium's one of the heaviest elements on the chart. Pulling that little bit out was hugely expensive. But once they figured out how to do that, then creating the bomb was not difficult. Navy Captain Deke Parsons created, a Navy guy, right, created a bomb that was simply a gun barrel with a piece of uranium lodged at one end of it, and another piece of uranium, a projectile, at the other end of it. And behind that, they put in two little bags of gunpowder. And it was just like, you've watched movies, you've seen how they do artillery cannon shells all the way back from the Civil War, right? You open the breech, you put the bomb in, you put the bullet in, and you put the gunpowder behind it, and you close the breech, and you pull the yankum thing, and the powder goes off and throws the bullet out. Well, they did the same thing, but inside of a container, right, which was called a bomb. So that thing was sure to work. They had no problem that if it fell on the ground hard enough, the black powder would have gone off and fired the uranium bullet into the uranium target, and it would have reached critical mass and exploded. Paul Tibbets was chosen for the job because he was far and away the best four-engine heavy bomber pilot in America. He was not an administrator, and he did not administer the Manhattan Project. All right, but they knew that he would deliver the bomb to the target, and that's why he was hired. And then they waited for perfect weather so that there would be no problem with identifying the target. And so on August 6th, he flew the Enola Gay. The bomb was loaded into the Enola Gay on August 5th, and it was, he dropped it, and it went off. That firing mechanism I was talking about that was finally finished on Tinian worked. The bomb exploded at about 1,800 feet. And so Hiroshima was not blown up. Hiroshima was crushed to the ground. All of the blast went down as the scientists predicted. But it did create what's now called fallout.
What was the reaction of the scientists and those involved with the first bombing after they saw
huge degree of relief. They were hoping that the next day Japan would surrender, and that no more bombs would be necessary, that all the killing would be over, that would be sufficient. And so when they got the word back at Los Alamos and D.C. and when every place else, right, they were hugely pleased. They were sure that the war was going to be over at that minute. Well, it was not successful because some of the members of the Japanese military command said, well, okay, so they destroyed another city. They've already burned 50 of our cities to the ground. So we lose another city. We're still going to fight them at the beach, and we're going to kill enough Americans to where we can sue for peace with negotiation, because the Japanese had always expected that the Americans would sue for peace, a negotiated peace, as they did at the end of World War I, which did not end in victory, but ended in an armistice and led, of course, then to World War II. Well, it was just 2 days later we dropped the Nagasaki bomb, the Fat Man bomb, and at that point they had no further excuses, and Hirohito called the war off.
The one of the chapters of your book is entitled Gifts from Heaven.
Yes. I have to tell you, Kathy, I got the original files in 1998, 20 years ago. That's when I went to Washington, D.C. with the help of the Northern Marianas Humanities Council, found these files and brought them home, and then had to interpret them, right? Because they were written in code. I didn't know who was talking to who or when, because the dates, everything was in code. Well, thanks to some help from friendly researchers in the United States, I figured it all out. I put them all in chronologic order. I knew what was happening. So I wrote the book twice before because I didn't know, I wasn't sure how to present this properly until I asked my dad. I said, Dad, what do you think about America's use of the atomic bombs? Bang. He wrote me back. And my dad drove a landing craft at Iwo Jima in Okinawa. And he said, those bombs saved my life, because I knew I'd never survive a third invasion. So that then gave me the confidence to write this story. Now, in writing the story, I came across these documents, right, from Japanese, right, after Hirohito made his initial decision to stop the war, that said the bombs were actually gifts from heaven, because they gave Emperor Hirohito the power to overrule the military clique without an internal revolution, which they were very afraid of. Remember that World War I led to the Bolshevik Revolution, the end of Tsarist Russia, and the creation of the Soviet Union. Right? There was also the possibility of an internal right-wing military coup that would take over Japan, and they would take the emperor and hide him. So, the gifts from heaven stopped the war. And I used that on purpose because that helped me write this book in such a perspective that not only American readers, but also Japanese readers, right, would appreciate the fact that the bombs saved more lives than they cost. And so that's the purpose of that title. At the end of the war, Secretary of War Henry Stimson was quoted as saying, we didn't want to use the bombs. Nobody. Everybody knew that they were going to kill. thousands of people, including innocent men, women, and children. All right? Do we use it or do we not use it? And according to Secretary of War Stimson, it was the least abhorrible choice. Use the bombs and stop the war, or let the war go on. Because by then, people of Japan were already starving. We had sieged the island. They were not receiving fuel or medicine or food. They were dying. 5,000 people were dying every day. And remember, it's not only Japan. We were still fighting the war in China, the Philippines, Southeast Asia, right? It wasn't just Americans dying. It wasn't just Japanese dying. A lot of Chinese and Burmese and everybody else were dying too. So the decision was made, we will use the bomb and hope that Japan surrenders immediately. And so they did, and it worked.
Do you feel that researching and writing this book has changed you personally in any way?
Oh. Good question. Yes, absolutely. It gave me a much broader perspective on not just the writing of and researching of history, but of personal feelings. When I first started work on this, I wasn't sure I even wanted to write the story, because at the time I began work on it, use of the bomb was very negative. If you read any American history books, they don't say much about them. You maybe one page, and it's very equivocal, right? They're not ready to touch it. But now that I finished the research and I'm getting reviews from good people, right, other researchers, I'm feeling much better that the hours, the days, the nights, the weekends that I spent were well worthwhile. And I feel very comfortable with America's use of the bomb. It was the right thing to do. It created a permanent, a lasting peace in the Pacific. And as we look today at what's going on between the United States and Korea and Japan, it's even more important. And I hope that when people have the opportunity to read through the book, it will help them also understand a little bit better about current events.
Well, the name of the book again is Tinian and the Bomb, Project Alberta and Operations Center Board, written by Don Farrell. It's now available on Amazon and at Bestseller. Before we go, any closing thoughts?
Yes. I would really like to see some locals begin work on studying and writing the history of the Marianas. You know, I'm going to be 71 in July. I got a couple of miles left on my retreads. I can pump out one or two more. But who's going to write the next history of the Northern Marianas? And I'm very disappointed to find out that very, very few of our high school graduates are going to college to study history and become historians. And very, very few are learning enough history to even become NMI history teachers. So I am hoping that is something that will, that my work perhaps will encourage locals, Chamorros and Carolinians, right, to study and write and teach the history of the Mariana Islands.
Don Farrell, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for this wonderful book.
Thank you, Kathy.
This has been Your Humanities Half Hour. I'm Catherine Perry.
This program was supported by a We the People grant awarded to the Northern Marianas Humanities Council from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities or the Northern Marianas Humanities Council.